Thank you for taking a few moments to consider what are the purposes of learning targets. So we want to go into the purpose of learning targets so that we can meet our target of this portion of the module, that I can identify the purposes of learning targets. So we're going to go through some of the purposes, and I want you to be thinking about. Thank you for taking some time to consider the purposes of learning targets. Over the course of the next few minutes, we're going to talk through some of the purposes, some of the key purposes for learning targets. And I invite you to think about what purpose resonates most with you in your current situation. We are trying to hit our target for this topic of I can identify the purposes of learning targets. And again, I invite you to consider what is the purpose for learning targets that resonates most for you in your particular context. When we think about learning targets, one of the first and key purpose is that it gives purpose to the learning. We all hope that every time we enter into a lesson that we know the purpose of that lesson, the purpose of the learning. Otherwise, we're simply the blind leading the blind. Nobody really knows where we're headed. If we have objectives, we might say, okay, my objectives really give me the purpose for learning. The difference between a learning target and an objective is that the objective is written for us as the teacher. And if as a teacher we understand the purpose of the learning, and we don't have a vehicle to communicate that, then we are spending our energy trying to get the students to meet the target or meet the objective that we've set for the lesson, while students are expending their energy to comply with whatever the tasks are that we've put in front of them for them to reach that goal, but they don't really know where they're headed. And so objectives are different than learning targets. Learning targets are very purposeful in that they invite learners into the learning. And we have to reflect, how often are we very clear with our students as to where we're headed for that lesson, that chapter, that week, that theme, that topic? Where are we headed? And do we invite the students into that learning? Another key purpose of learning targets is a vehicle to invite the students into the learning so that we all know where we're headed with that particular piece. So the third purpose we have is it communicates learning. So a learning target is intended to help us communicate the learning for the day, again, or the lesson, or whatever that piece of learning is. So for example, our learning target for this video is that I can identify the purpose of learning targets. So hopefully you've already started thinking about a couple of the purposes. So I'm able to communicate the expectation as the teacher, and you're able to start to understand where we're headed with the learning. So it allows us to set a purpose for the learning, it invites the learners into that learning, and it communicates the learning. The fourth one that I have on here is that it helps focus the learning. The phrasing of learning target is intentional. It helps us target so that we're headed after a particular learning or expectation, and it gives us the ability to be focused in our instruction. A couple other key benefits or purposes around learning targets is that it increases motivation. We are more inclined as learners to go down a path when we know where we're headed. So by being able to craft a solid learning target that communicates where we're headed will increase the likelihood that students will come along for the ride. It will increase motivation by letting them know, hey, here's where we're headed with this, and we can all see where we're going. Another benefit or purpose of learning targets is that it helps us break down complex learning into smaller parts. So for example, if my learning target for the entire online workshop that we're kind of working through today is that I can capture evidence of student learning, that's a pretty abstract and complex target to hit. But what I'm able to do is to begin to break that down into, well, if that's what I need to do, if I need to walk away being able to capture evidence of student learning, in order to do that, I must what? And in my thinking, in order to do that, we must be able to articulate the purpose of learning targets. We must begin to see what the features of learning targets are, which we'll do in the next segment. And then we need to be able to craft a learning target, and you'll see is our third. So learning targets, the way that you begin to process them is by taking that standard that you're headed for and then break it down into the smaller parts that will lead you to, and lead you and your students to the understanding of that standard. Another benefit then in the idea that it breaks it down is it helps us process the standards ourselves. And I'm going to show you an example of kind of what that might look like as we begin to talk through our standards. And the last purpose I want to share with you is that having learning targets helps monitor progress. So once I'm able to articulate, communicate, and set out a target for the learning that's clearly communicated to all, it will enable me to better monitor progress toward that target. So once I'm able to cast that vision and everybody knows where we're headed, it'll be much easier for me to monitor progress toward that target. So where do the targets come from? Where do we begin to start thinking and developing targets? Well, first thinking about our objectives for our lesson, where do we often get our objectives? From standards. So we want to start with the standards. And it's important to remember that the standards represent the floor. Our standards are what all students should know and be able to do as a result of our course. So we definitely want to start with those standards. But what we need to recognize is that not all standards are created equal. They're not as all easy or clear to develop learning targets from. And let me show you this example. So what I have here as my example is a Common Core Math standard and a Phys Ed standard, an elementary Phys Ed standard. The Common Core Math standard says use place value understanding to round whole numbers to the nearest 10 or 100. So we begin to think about how do I communicate that as a learning target. It might be I can use place value to round whole numbers to the nearest 10. It's very clear. We can all understand exactly what that means. As adults reading that standard, we know what that means to round numbers to the nearest 10. It's pretty cut and dry. So I'm able to pretty easily wrap my head around that standard and come up with what a target might look like. When we look at this Phys Ed standard for elementary Phys Ed, it says students will perform basic motor skills and manipulative skills. They will attain competency in a variety of physical activities and proficiency in a few select complex motor and sports activities. When we look at this standard, it's not as easy to just put I can in front of it and say I can perform basic motor and manipulative skills. We have to have more conversation about what that means. What are the basic motor and manipulative skills? They will attain competency in a variety of physical activities. What activities? What does competency mean? And what do we mean by variety? So my point in this is that developing learning targets that are standards-based starts with a close reading of that standard and what it's asking, and then probably a conversation about what that means for student learning. In the next portion of our online module, we're going to start taking a look at what are the criteria that need to be in place to develop a learning target. So now that we've had some time to consider the purposes, again, I had invited you to think about what purpose resonates most with you of the purposes that we've talked through. And I'm going to ask you in the next portion to So now that we've been able to talk through some of the purposes of learning targets, in the next topic of our online module, we're going to take a look at the criteria for development of a learning target. What makes a target more effective in terms of the wording and crafting of a learning target? So we'll go into that next. But what I had invited you to think about with this video is what is a purpose that resonated with you? Is there one of the purposes we've just talked through that that you're now saying, that sounds interesting, that's something I'd like to work toward.